Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Infinite Learning's webinar. My name is Isabel Barnes, and I'm the Media and Marketing Manager at Infinite Learning. We are delighted to be running this webinar today in partnership with Asma Khanum from Chatterbug, and we welcome her to speak about identifying and supporting children with speech, language, and communication needs, otherwise known as SLCN. This webinar forms a great foundation for understanding SLCN and support. This interactive workshop will increase your understanding of how speech, language and communication skills develop and how to identify and support children with SLCN. Our training courses are perfect for education and childcare professionals such as teachers, teaching assistants and Zenkos. And this course is also suitable for speech language therapists and student SLTs. Before I hand over to Asma, a few small areas of housekeeping today. Attendees are automatically on listen only mode. We will allow Asma to deliver her presentation in full and then have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat area to ask a question at any point during the presentation, and we will use the last 20 minutes of the webinar to answer as many questions as possible. A video recording of this webinar will be sent to you tomorrow, along with a short webinar survey and a certificate of attendance. We would be most grateful for your feedback. We will also send you a PDF of the PowerPoint that Asma has very kindly shared with us. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Asma Khanum. Asma, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So I am Asma Khanum, and I am a speech and language therapist based in the UK, and I trained at UCL about, it must be about 16, 17 years ago. Hard to remember when you get to that point. It's actually across the world, we are known as speech and language therapists or speech and language pathologists. I think they use probably interchangeably over in your neck of the woods. So today's webinar is just to give you a little bit of an intro into what SLCN is and a little bit more about the course that we're running later on and what you'll be able to gain from that course. So if you work with children and young people across primary, nursery, secondary, speech and language is something that you probably want to or need to know about because it affects, well, communication is something that affects all of us, but without having foundation, good foundation skills in speech, language and communication, children and young people will struggle to access education. So for me personally, education, as we know, is the key to future academic success, future life successes. But a lot of our children and young people can't access education, and I really feel very passionate about doing everything we can to support professionals and parents that are working with these children and young people so that they can access education and make the most of it. The other popular misconception is that children with speech and language difficulties aren't intelligent, and that is actually incorrect. Quite often, children with SLCN are quite bright and adapt, so it's not always easy to spot them. And you know, it's really important that we're able to acknowledge that so we can support them, identify and support them as early as possible, because they quite often tend to be intelligent. They can actually access education. It just needs to be modified in a way that they can access it. So let's have a look. So this is about me. I've kind of given you a little bit whistle-stop tour about me already, but I trained at UCL about 17 years ago, and I started my career working in the NHS, which is our National Health Service. And I worked across the country, worked in the south, worked in the north, and around 2008, I moved to Yorkshire, which is based up in the north of England. And I realised that there was a massive disparity between the services that were available in the south and the north. And also professionals' knowledge around speech and language was very, very limited. In fact, there was a survey carried out in UK schools with teachers, and 80% said that they'd never received any training specifically around supporting children with speech and language as part of their training, which obviously, especially in the UK, there's a massive push towards mainstream education. So teachers were then expected to support a whole range of children with speech and language difficulties, including the one that had very specialist needs. But actually, what you will find from today is that a large proportion of our children and young people, you can't tell that they have speech and language difficulties. So it's really, really important that professionals working with them feel confident in identifying and supporting them. Just move my screen around a little bit. Oops. So just to give you an idea about a little bit more about us, Chatterbug as an organisation, we're a social enterprise and we work with a range of schools. We have loads of experience with working in education. Our team is very, very experienced. We're commissioned by local authorities and the NHS to provide their speech therapy services as well. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that we know a lot about speech and language, and it's our bread and butter. It's something that we do day in, day out, and we support a lot of professionals who are working with children with speech and language needs. As a company, our values are open, connected, dependable, and fortitude. So we're always pushing the boundaries to try and find new ways of working. And we were very excited about this opportunity to work with Infinite Learning to be able to share our training and our knowledge internationally, because actually it isn't just a UK issue. Speech and language difficulties affect everybody. And just some information about the feedback from our training. They have been very positively received, which is why it's an area that we're trying to expand and do more work with. Okay, so who is this specific course for? Well, as I explained, speech and language difficulties can affect anyone. So this particular workshop is aimed at anybody from nursery, preschool, all the way up to secondary schools and colleges, anyone that's working with children and young people. So I've summarized that bit. So I feel like, okay, I might have done this a little bit backwards, but let's start with what are speech and language difficulties, because that's the magic question. Because I think people think they know what it is, but it's not always what you think it is. And some of the difficulties are very visible. So, for example, you've probably heard of people who stammer, people who can't say words clearly. So all of those difficulties are very, very visible, and you can tell somebody has a speech and language difficulty. Then there, and in the adult population, people that might have had some kind of a head injury or a stroke, their speech may be slurred, they might struggle to say words. So all of those difficulties are visible difficulties, and they may be accompanied by other features. So a lot of children who are on the autistic spectrum have speech and language needs, and they may have other kind of sensory needs as well. So those are the obvious ones. And the hidden difficulties, and they're the ones that I'm really, really interested in, because they're the ones that quite often miss out on crucial support that you can provide within your schools and settings. And they are, and the way I describe these to kind of like someone who doesn't know much about speech and language is, think about the times in your life where you might be out or you might meet someone for the first time and you think, there's something a bit strange about that person. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but they're a bit strange. They're the ones that quite often tend to have speech and language needs, very, very subtle. So they might be the ones that can put loads of sentences together and say lots of words, and on the surface appear that they're sharing lots of information with you. But you walk away and you think, what did they say? I have no idea what they've just said. And what you'll find is what the issue there might be that they're saying loads of words, but actually grammatically it's incorrect. How they're putting the sentences and the words together to form a sentence is incorrect and doesn't make sense. Or it may be even more subtle. So depending on what research you read, anything between 60 and 96% of our communication is nonverbal, right? So it may be that they have issues or difficulties or some kind of barrier with those nonverbal communications. So they may have inappropriate eye contact, or they may talk too fast, or they don't know how to take turns in the conversations. But again, can use lots of language. Their words are clear, but they just don't know how to use that, how to use those words and how to use language appropriately. And actually, any caseload in our schools tends to be 80% of our caseload tends to be, and by caseload I mean people that we work with in a setting, tend to be these hidden difficulties. And again, the other thing that we're finding in schools is that, particularly in the UK, is a big push towards supporting children in the early years with speech and language difficulties. And then you get to key stage 2 and miraculously they all seem to vanish off your caseload. And actually they haven't been miraculously cured. I wish that was the case. What happens is that they learn to mask and adapt to their difficulties and to their needs. So they're even harder to spot. And the way it manifests is different. So it may manifest as having emotional outbursts or behavioral difficulties, or just underperforming in education. And a really personal example I'll share with you is my daughter, who is 8, was diagnosed with autism earlier this year. And she is your classic, very bright, very well behaved, very superficially articulate child, but completely masked all her difficulties. And you know, even from us, it took a lot of investigation, a lot of digging to understand what's going on. And actually, fundamentally for her, even though she's a great reader and academically a very top performer, and when most people meet her, they think she's not autistic. She's very bright, she's very smart, very mature. What they don't realize is that she really struggles to understand words, specific words, specific vocabulary, because she's very, very literal in her understanding of them. So she needs to be taught explicitly what those words mean. And also decision making when it comes to words. So when people are asking her, if she's in a room and she's having to process loads of information and people are asking her a question, chances are she won't be able to answer that question, not because she's not able, but because it's a lot of information for her to process, and it's the processing element that she's struggling with. And a really, really cute example that I will share with you is I overheard a conversation specifically around her literal understanding. I overheard a conversation with her and her older sister, and she was saying, you know, when Mama used to say we're going to go out in bare feet, I used to think, how am I going to grow bear's feet? And it was really cute and it's really endearing. But that's an example of, it's not something that she shared with me, and she probably wouldn't share any examples of her lack of understanding with her school teacher either. But she internalized it and came and spoke to her sister about it. So it just gives you a really good example of how someone like my daughter could struggle to access education. Actually, she's in a mainstream school, and absolutely that's exactly where she should be. But she will fail in school without the right adaptations that she has. So hopefully that gives you a really good insight as to why it's so important to identify these children and young people as early as possible and to put the right measures in place. And just to give you some examples, I really wanted to find, so some of the statistics I'll share with you. Speech and language therapists are known for treating people with stammers. So quite a few of these individuals here have a stammer. Joe Biden is probably the most famous one at the moment, president of the US. And then speech and language therapists also work with people who are able to communicate, but don't have the functional tools that they need to communicate. We call them articulators. So there may be something that's that they're unable to use in terms of their mouth or their muscles. So Stephen Hawkins is a really good example of that, where he used an alternative communication device. We call it an AAC, alternative augmentative communication device. Then we have Anthony Hopkins, who was diagnosed as autistic in his adult. Marilyn Monroe had a stammer, and as did Susan Boyle. So I really wanted to find famous individuals that were diagnosed with DLD, because that's a whole other topic, and actually a large proportion of our children have DLD, which is developmental language disorder, but are misdiagnosed as having things like autism or dyslexia. I found loads of famous people who identified as having dyslexia, but my gut instinct is that if we were to assess them, we would probably re-diagnose some of them. So DLD is developmental language disorder where, again, quite often they're intelligent, they don't have any of the social elements and sensory elements like somebody on the autistic spectrum. They're purely their difficulties around understanding and using language. So with lots of adaptations and strategies within the classroom environment, strong push on oracy, these children and young people can really succeed in education. So what is a speech and language therapist? So a speech and language therapist is a professional that has trained has carried out completed a vocational degree as a speech and language therapist. In the UK, it can be an undergrad or a master's. In other countries, it's a master's, but essentially we train in a whole range of areas, including linguistics, anatomy and physiology. Then we have the audiology side. In fact, in some countries, speech and language therapists are dual qualified. So they're speech and language therapists and they're audiologists as well. And we work with children, young people, and adults with anything to do with their eating, feeding, swallowing, and obviously their talking. And by talking, and the course will go into in a lot more depth about what speech, language, and communication entails, but it's far more than being able to say words. It's about the understanding of language. So you might meet somebody who can talk and have a full-blown conversation with you, but they don't understand what you're saying to them. And the speech refers to the actual sounds that we make. So the course will go into this in a lot more detail, but I love what I do because it's so diverse, but it is very, very complicated. There are lots of specialist areas within speech and language. So voice is an area that some therapists specialize in. And again, it has a medical element as well as a psychological element. So it is a fascinating career. And why should you come on this course? Oops, I'm getting rid of the numbers. So 1 in 12 children worldwide have a speech and language difficulty. It's actually the most common childhood disability, but not as well known. So in fact, speech and language skills are probably one of the most cognitively complex tasks a child has to master before they hit 5. It's even more complicated than learning to walk, or many other things that we expect children to be able to do by the time they're 5. So it is very, very complicated. There are lots of elements involved, and there's that huge nature-nurture element to it as well. But most of it has to be in place by the time the child is 5, and there's that critical period of language development. If we miss that child is likely to struggle to catch up, or it will go on to be a lifelong need. Only 3% of the school population is ever identified because of the subtle presentation. And the impact of not identifying SLCN is huge. So here in the UK, there was a study carried out in a Youth Offenders Institute, actually here in Leeds. And what they found was that 68% of the young offenders prison population had an underlying speech and language need. The shocking stat for me is that 5% had ever been identified or referred to speech and language. So quite a lot of children and young people are being missed. And as I say, there's a strong focus on identifying the younger children, and you get to key stage 2, and it's like they miraculously disappear, but they don't. They just become more subtle, and then obviously key stage 3, they become even more subtle, and you see even more issues around behaviour and engagement. And that's it. That's my whistle-stop tour about what speech and language is. And I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'm ready to move to questions.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That was great. So I know that I personally have a few things to pick up on. I mean, I think it's really interesting what you said about how, you know, with kids who have autism and SLCN, sometimes they know what they want to say, but they can't find the right words to say it. I think that was it's a really interesting point. And again, with you talking about the famous people with Biden, the way I learned that he had a stammer was that I saw him being mocked about it in the news. So I think it's really important that we promote these sort of open conversations about SLCN and promote awareness for it, so that we can discuss it and not have it be mocked in the media. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm just waiting to see if we've got any questions in the chat.
I'm not sure how well known he is now, but growing up, I was very aware of Jonathan Ross, and he was famous because he had a lisp. And that's basically what made him unique and made his name. And ironically, he had the R in his name as well, which you can't pronounce. But yeah, so he was a famous one growing up. And I actually, another really interesting story, I had a head teacher of a school once randomly call me 5 o'clock, just about to finish work, and said, so I've just interviewed a teacher and I really want to appoint this person, but this is how they talk, and then gave me a description. He said, and what I really want to understand is it just them being lazy, or is it a speech and language difficulty? Because I don't want to discriminate against them if it's a disability, but if it's just lazy speech, well, I don't want to appoint them. So that led to a very interesting conversation, and again shows how lack of awareness that people have about speech and language difficulties.
I think it's great that we're sort of moving into more of an era where SEND topics are more openly promoted in schools. So for sure, SLCN is definitely one that we need to push out there a little bit more and get people educated on.
And the solutions, and the course will go into in a lot more depth. The solutions are quite often simple things that you can do around promoting talk within the settings and the environment, but promoting talk in a structured way that will support children with speech and language difficulties, like, for example, word finding, strategies that you can use to create sentences. So there's loads of little hints and tips and tricks that you can definitely do within the education setting.
And I think as adults, we're quite well versed with how to discuss SEND, SLCN, and promote it. What would you say to a teacher who works with a kid who's got a speech impediment and doesn't know how to handle it, or other kids in school are bullying them? What would your advice be to that teacher?
So you can approach it in a couple of ways depending on the age of the child. With a lot of our children, what we find is that they just want that acknowledgement that it's not them, that's how they talk, and then that's okay. And also not to focus on how they talk in terms of how they sound, but have times and opportunities where you're focusing on what they're saying. Because if it's a speech sound need and it's not, their speech isn't very clear, it doesn't mean what they're trying to say isn't correct. It's just how we perceive it. So I would really emphasize on, that's great, what you're saying is great, I love your idea. If you can't understand what they're saying, ask them to repeat it. Be very honest with them. I can't hear it, it's not very clear, so help me here, and develop some strategies around how to ask those questions. How does that child feel comfortable? If it's a younger child, so under 5, what we often say is model the correct pronunciation. Don't correct the child. Don't ask the child to say it correctly or repeat it after you, because they can't. But what you can do is model the correct pronunciation. So if they're saying tar instead of car, you can say, yep, that's right, it's a car. That's a car. So what you're doing is you're modeling it, the correct pronunciation. You're giving the child another model, but you're not impacting on their confidence in terms of wanting to communicate. So what we don't want them to do is stop wanting to talk.
Yeah, of course. So I think we've got a few questions. I mean, one was, what strategies would you recommend for an inclusion teacher to use to support children with SLCN? I think we just covered that, unless there's anything else you'd like to add on top of that.
There are so many. There are so many, and and it all depends on the need of the child. This is where I would really would suggest that trying to engage with a speech and language therapist to talk through individual needs is really, really important. But there are talking frames that you can use. Colourful semantics is something that we promote heavily in the UK and is very, very effective. And what that does is provides a structure for children to develop written language or spoken language. So you're killing two birds with one stone, promoting a language-rich environment where there are opportunities to have talking activities, again, promoting oracy. With the older children, again, giving them that framework to engage in things like a discussion or a debate, but giving them the talking frameworks. There's so many things that you can do, and it all very much depends on the age and the need.
I think it's like, it is like autism and like every other kind of learning difficulty where no case is exactly the same, and you kind of have to tailor it to the children rather than
absolutely.
to the
Yeah, there are universal strategies that you can implement that will help promote all children's communication development. But for individual children, it needs to be very specific. Had a little peek from someone.
Okay, and so just another one. So early detection of learning disabilities is very helpful. Do you have any sort of tips and tricks on how to detect a learning disability, SLCN, early on?
Yep. Again, I would say the webinar will, the actual course will go into in a lot more detail because it's such a broad field. But I would be looking at behaviour, where there's ongoing behavioural needs without a clear explanation. I would look at their social skills and what are they like with their peer group. Are they interacting with their peer group? Because actually to not want to interact is quite unusual. But a lot of our children with speech and language difficulties, even if it's very subtle stuff like a speech sound difficulty, children don't want to interact and communicate with their peers. So look for those. Look at whether they are initiating interactions. That's a really, really good one, actually, because again, with children, most children want to engage in conversation and engage and offer their ideas and views, but if they're not initiating, and then there'll be the obvious ones in terms of, do their sentences make sense? Are they able to follow instructions that you give them? What does that look like? Are they watching to see other children before they follow instructions? Yeah, and then the obvious ones are obviously the stammering, listening for how they're talking, the speech sounds, listening how clear their speech is. Eye contact is a good giveaway as well. In young children, turn taking, how they're playing, what kinds of play they're doing, all of that is interlinked.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think that is all of the questions that we have. So that just about concludes our webinar for today. So thank you, Asma, for sharing your passion, knowledge and expertise. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. If you do have any questions that weren't answered, or if you'd like any further advice on SLCN training, please do not hesitate to get in touch and we will be more than happy to assist. And I've just noticed we've had another question just pop through, so I'm just going to pause there and ask you quickly. So how would you be able to tell the difference between EAL and SLCN?
Right, that's a really good question. And again, that's another one of my areas of passion, because if you've never worked with children from a bilingual background, it's quite difficult to spot. But actually, once you know, so it all goes back. I'm not sure how much teachers know about the Bix and the Calps theory, but we will go into it on the course a little bit more. But it's all about being able to tell the difference between how that child is interacting with their peers, even without talking, to whether they are even attempting to initiate interactions. That is a really big teller. Children who speak a different language and start a school environment in another language tend to go through a period where they may not say anything. And that gap, that can be quite a long period, actually. So what you want to look at, it can be anything up to 2 years, some of the research indicates, right? But then there is another condition, speech and language condition called selective mutism. And that's where it's a phobia to do with talking. So, and high proportion of children who have SM are also bilingual. But anyway, that's kind of what the research says. So that's something just to be aware of on the side. But what you will find is that basic interpersonal communication skills, wanting to engage with their peers, most children that are typically developing will develop those skills within a few months. And they will feel very comfortable in speaking in their home language if they have those abilities, even though others around them might not understand. You'll find that they'll start mixing languages and they'll pick up the odd words. So with the right stimulation, the children who are just purely EAL, they will come along. However, the evidence and the research tells us it can take up to 5 years for them to match their peers academically.
Wow.
So if you put that into context with someone who's starting primary school, and we definitely see this in the UK, that they might underperform through primary school, but then when they get to secondary school or high school, that's when you see them really, really perform academically. So you've got to separate the two. Also, it's really, really important to push the home language, because if they have a really good foundation in their home language, then they're likely to pick up the second language a lot more quicker. So there are subtle differences, is a summary to the question, but you do want some expert support. If it's not an area that you're comfortable with, you do want some specific support around helping to identify those children. But the positive thing is the same strategies will work for both. The pure EAL children will just progress a lot quicker because they don't have any underlying speech and language needs. And the other question that you could ask the parents is, does the child talk in their home language, and do they have any issues in their home language? Because a child with speech and language difficulties is going to have that difficulty in their home language or the second language.
So it's really something you've got to investigate with the parents as well.
Yeah, definitely. And just remember, bilingualism is absolutely a strength. Children who are bilingual, actually, it acts as a protective mechanism for SLCN. So, and general intelligence, so children who are bilingual tend to be able to think more laterally and cognitively more able, so generally tend to do better academically anyway. So it's a massive milestone, but it's an area that I'm really passionate about, again, because it's an area of special bilingualism, one of my areas of specialism. I love it. It's fascinating.
It sounds very fascinating. And I mean, this webinar, I found it very, very interesting, very fascinating. And this is only a little snapshot into, your 4-part course that you're running with us. So that is 4 sessions, 1 hour each, starting on Monday, the 7th of February in 2022, called Identifying and Supporting Children with Speech, Language and Communication Needs. Very affordable at 600 dirhams for the entire thing, I think. So a quick reminder to our attendees that the video recording of this webinar will be sent to you tomorrow, along with a short webinar survey and a certificate of attendance. We'd be grateful for your feedback, and we will also send you a PDF of the PowerPoint that Asma has very kindly shared with us. So please do visit the e-learning section on our website, www.infinitelearning.ae, to find out more. And please also visit our webinar page to see what else is coming up soon. Until then, thank you so much, Asma, for running this webinar today. It's been really fascinating. I've personally learned quite a lot. I hope our attendees have too. And we hope to see you all at our next webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.